afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the NIA Small Business Funding webinar on accelerating Alzheimer's and aging research. We're about to start the presentation in just a couple of minutes. We're just letting people log on. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the National Institute on Aging Small Business Funding webinar on accelerating Alzheimer's research and aging research. We're very glad you could join us today. Next slide. Next slide. The webinar will begin shortly. We're going to ask everyone to submit their questions throughout the course of the webinar. You'll find a menu panel on the side of your screen. It's usually located to the right side, and it's a black panel. And you'll see an option to click on called Q&A. You can click on that, and it'll open up a question and answer box. And please submit your questions at any time during the presentation, and we will be glad to answer them after the presentation in about half an hour. We have a closed captioning available if you need it, and you can see the website right here. And also, if you require it, there is a number to call and an email for a website for technical support. Also, at the end of the presentation, we will be sending out a link for a feedback form. We'd love to know what you thought of the webinar and also what you'd like to see in the future so that we can continue to provide things that you find really useful. Next slide. I'd like to thank our speakers and hosts this afternoon. In addition to the National Institute on Aging, we have our partners from SBIR and BioCT and Southern California Bio, and we're really glad that these organizations were able to join us, and we welcome all of your members to our presentation today. I'd just like to go over the agenda very quickly. We'll do an introduction of objectives, and then Todd Haim, who is the presenter for today. He's the chief of the director of the Office of Small Business Research at NIA, and he will give an overview of the program as well as some tips for success, and also discuss some of the opportunities currently available and the resources we make available to both applicants and grantees. Following that, we will have a moderated Q&A. We will read the questions that you submitted throughout the course of the webinar. So with that, I'd like to introduce Todd Haim, Director of the Office of Small Business Research. Todd, take it away.
Thank you, Melissa. So the SBIR and STTR programs are congressionally mandated programs that are essentially government-wide. So each agency that provides extramural research funding, which is typically funding to academic institutions and things of the like, needs to spend a percentage of that money on small businesses through the SBIR and STTR programs. For SBIR, that percentage is 3.2%, and for STTR, it's 0.45%. And I'll go over the differences of both. There are a lot of advantages to applying for SBIR and STTR funding. Probably the biggest is that it is completely non-dilutive. There's not a loan, there's no repayment, there's no impact on stock, shares, there's no royalties, anything of that sort. The small businesses or whoever has the intellectual property rights retain those rights. It provides recognition and verification, validation, so it can often help attract additional funding by showing that the NIH peer reviewers and program, thought highly of the product as well. In order to be eligible, you have to meet the United States Small Business Administration's definition of a small business, which means you must be organized for-profit U.S. business, 500 or fewer employees, but I should say that the majority of companies we fund are around anywhere from 2 to 12 employees. It's rare that we would fund a company with, hundreds of employees. And the companies do have to be owned and operated by U.S. individuals, or they can be owned and operated by venture capital operating firms, providing that no single venture capital firm owns 50% of the company. So if it's a syndicate that together owns 50%, they are eligible. I mentioned how SBIR and STTR are two separate programs, although when I say SBIR for the rest of the presentation, I'm often talking about both because they are pretty similar. There are a couple of key differences, though. One being that while SBIR permits and in many cases has, as part of the project, a collaboration with a research institution, in STTR, it's actually required. And with SBIR, for a phase 1, only up to 1/3 of the work can be subcontracted, and subcontracts often pertains to academic collaborations. But with STTR, that can go to as much as 60%, as long as the company, the small business, is doing at least 40% of the work. And then the final difference is that with SBIR, one of the PIs, if it's a multi-PI arrangement, has to be at the small business, so majority employed by the small business. But with STTR, the PI can be at the academic institution. One thing to clarify, because this does get confusing, is when I say must be majority employed by the small business, that's the percentage of their employment, not the amount of time that they're going to spend on the SBIR project. So that doesn't need to be 50%, but just their employment. The program goes through, Congress created it in a series of phases. They weren't thinking about clinical research when they did that, so there's no correlation in nomenclature between a phase 1 SBIR and a phase of clinical research. In the majority of the cases, SBIR, STTR awards tend to fund preclinical research, although we do fund clinical work as well. Phase 1 is considered proof of concept, discovery, feasibility. It's usually up to 1 year, up to $300,000 for our main investigator-initiated solicitation, and for AD/ADRD board solicitation, it can be up to $450,000. This is at NIA. Please note that different institutes have different levels. One thing that I always find confusing is there are a lot of different budget numbers that get floated around. The Congress created what's called budget guidelines, and then they created a cap on that's higher than those guidelines for the NIH. And that's around $252,000 for phase 1. But then they said that the agency can go higher for certain areas, and for the vast, vast majority of the areas that we fund at the NIA and really at the NIH, we have the approved waivers. So that's where the limits that I'm saying are what our actual NIA limits are above the so-called hard cap, which is what it's officially called. So you can go up to $300,000 for any NIA project and $450,000 for AD. For phase 2, it's up to $2 million, or if it's that AD/ADRD solicitation, Alzheimer's disease related, it can be up to $2.5 million. Now, traditionally, a phase 2 would have to follow a phase 1. However, we did recently relaunch the direct to phase 2. So if you've actually done proof of concept, and as an example, if you're developing a therapeutic, then if you have pilot in vivo data, that's something that many phase 1s would aim to get. So if you already have that before you come to SBIR, then you can apply directly for that phase 2. The other program that we have is where you can apply for phase 1 and phase 2 at the same time, and that's called the fast track application. So it's one application that includes the work you would do in both phases. The advantage of the fast track compared to phase 1 is that once you complete the phase 1, you would demonstrate to our staff that you've met the milestones. And if we confirm that you met the milestones, then you would transition to phase 2 without having to reapply for the phase 2. And it's critical, if there's one thing you take from this webinar, is to talk to us before you apply. And one of the things that we will spend a lot of time guiding companies on is what the right phase for you is. You know, fast tracks and direct to phase 2s can be more competitive and are really only meant for certain stages of research and companies and everything. So that's where we're here to provide that guidance. And I'll talk about that as we get through the presentation. And then finally, we just launched the Commercialization Readiness Pilot Program. We launched it. It's an additional just under $3.4 million. It can be either parallel to the phase 2 or after the phase 2. And that program, the CRP, actually supports, it can support non-research activities. So the type of thing, it's designed to support the types of things that you need to do to commercialize or get to the clinic, whether that be, you know, hiring a regulatory consultant to work with FDA and put together all the documents, or, you know, do scale-up manufacturing activities. That stuff wouldn't always be review well or be what's allowed in the NIH project, but it is for the CRP, and you can the CRP removes those outsourcing restrictions that I mentioned earlier. And then finally, you can also apply for a phase 2B, but that has to be after the phase 2, and that can be an additional $3 million. So in like an 8-year type time period, if everything goes well, you can have as much as $9 million in funding for each project. So it can become pretty sizable. In terms of budget specifics, I mentioned that, you know, subcontracting is limited. One thing to note is how we define a subcontract. So if it is a collaboration, in which case there is intellectual input on both sides, then that is a subcontract, and that's typically a partnership, for example, with an academic institution. But if you are sending something to a CRO, it's a commercially available service, you're providing the drug or whatever it is, they're running the assay, all the analysis being done by a small business, and you're paying for it on a fee-per basis, meaning no indirect costs are being charged by the service provider, then you're actually buying a service as one of your supplies, and that can be part of the company's cost and part of what the company's, you know, that company's 2/3 of their cost. So that allows companies to be at least partially virtual. Now, the program, it's officially not eligible for virtual companies, so you do have to show that, you know, you are doing some work by the company and can be fully virtual. But this does allow it to be partially virtual. I always remind people that for an SBIR award, in your budget, you can request a 7% fee. It's called the profit. It's essentially the only money you'll get from the NIH where there's no restrictions and we don't ask how you'll spend it. And you'll find that that money becomes really critical to pay for things that the NIH typically doesn't pay for but are required by a company, whether they be your legal fees or, you know, other types of costs that you need to pay for. So I always encourage everyone to request that 7% fee in their application. So as was mentioned, I manage the NIA Office of Small Business Research, and this office got launched in just about 1.5 years ago. We have 6 core function areas. The first is to coordinate the program across the National Institute on Aging. We provide guidance to applicants ahead of their submission, as I mentioned. We do outreach such as this webinar, and we're often at conferences across the country. We see different areas, we develop different funding opportunities, as we'll talk about. We try to help our companies in terms of networking, whether that be connecting them to other NIA resources or connecting them to external sources of funding. And then we provide entrepreneurship training and webinars of the like. So in terms of what types of resources we provide, we actually recently joined the NIH Applicant Assistance Program, which is a 10-week coaching program to help develop your applications. It's offered once each standard funding period, and you can email us to get more information on the AAP. It's a great resource to help people that have never been able to get NIH funding before. So in order to be eligible, you have to have never received NIH SBIR funding before. And then we also have, in your application, you can request funding for technical assistance. For companies that are funded by us, we have a diversity supplement, so you can add diverse researchers to your team, and we will provide the funding for that as part of the project. We have entrepreneurial training programs such as the C3I program for medical device innovators, and now through the NIH's Office of Small Business Entrepreneurial Education and Development, we have several resources to help portfolio companies, such as a regulatory specialist that can help connect you with FDA or get you information that you need to be thinking about. We have entrepreneurs in residence that are former investors that can help advise you on a pitch deck. We have, patent experts that can help you in that regard. So really a wide range of resources through that office. And then finally, we have an entrepreneurial training program, that a NIH adapted version of I-Core, but that's for companies that already have a phase 1. So in terms of the NIA specifically, we are looking for, pretty much across the NIH, looking for innovative solutions to significant unmet clinical needs. But we also have a special interest in Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. And that's where I mentioned those different budget levels. But we also fund everything across the aging paradigm. So, things like enabling people to age in place, also support community living, enhance healthy aging, directly target the aging process, and reduce disease. These are all things that are within our mission. Caregiver coordination, navigation, as an example. So it's a pretty broad mission that we fund. We have the Omnibus Funding Opportunity, which is the investigator-initiated across the NIH, 3 due dates a year, and then we have specific funding opportunities. So the application to award process. Typically, the whole process, starting in the top left, can take up to 12 months, especially if you end up needing to resubmit, which many first-time applicants do need to resubmit to get a competitive enough score to be funded. But if you are fortunate enough to get funded in your first try, it typically would be between 5 and 9 months that you would get funding. And it does depend a bit on which application date you apply for based on congressional budget cycles and the like. But this gives you an overview. Within about 2 months, 2 to 3 months, you'll have a score from when you submit. So if you submit on April 5th, by the end of June, you can expect to have your score. For 80% of the companies, based on that score, we can give you a good feel for how likely you are to be funded. For the companies that are right at that borderline, it would take a little bit longer. So this shows you the NIA portfolio. So as I mentioned, we coordinate the program across 4 divisions: the Division of Aging Biology, the Division of Behavioral and Social Research, the Division of Geriatrics and Clinical Gerontology, and the Division of Neuroscience. And on the right shows you the different types of technologies. And of course, none of these are mutually exclusive. So we made some judgment calls there because, as you can imagine, for example, the digital mobile health slice does overlap a lot with the sensors and monitoring technologies. But this gives you a rough idea of the types of things that we are funding. So I mentioned the Omnibus as the overarching investigator-initiated funding opportunity, but we also have several specific FOAs, and the ones that we have right now are in the AD/ADRD space, but there'll be a new concept potentially around aging specifically, so there will be more beyond just AD and ADRD coming, so we really fund the whole landscape. And I mentioned the commercialization readiness program already. That's that, either during the phase 2 or after the phase 2, where you can pay for potentially non-research activities that are critical to get to clinic or commercialized. So transitioning a bit to kind of talk about, what we look for and how to be competitive. The review criteria are the same by label as academic grants such as NIA. So for example, your 5 review criteria being team, environment, significance, innovation, and approach. However, for SBIR, we add a commercialization criteria, but we also look at those 5 review criteria differently. So for example, with the significance criteria, in an academic grant, we'd be looking at how much knowledge are you increasing in the field? What are your chances for a landmark publication? But for SBIR, we're talking about how much are you changing the clinical paradigm? How strong is your value proposition and your competitive advantage? So it's still significance, but it's looking at significance in a very different way. And the other thing to mention is that with SBIR, the focus is on the product with the science underpinning that, as opposed to the focus being on the science. So I mentioned earlier that we really are here to advise you before you apply, and one of the most score-driving pages of applications is what's called the specific aims page, though it's a lot more than specific aims. It's really the executive summary of a NIH SBIR application. And the way I recommend that to be written is that in the first half to 2/3 of that page, you want to be able to basically show the reviewers and our staff why your project is the most exciting of the thousands of projects that we get. So that's your elevator pitch. You want to talk about the technology prototype to be developed, the innovation, the value proposition, competitive advantage. You can include textual highlights of the preliminary data that you will be showing in more detail in the rest of the application. And then, of course, the relevance to our mission. In the last third to half of the page, that's where you would describe what you will actually do with the funds that you are trying to get, so what those aims would be. I found that sending us that page specifically allows us to provide the most concrete guidance to you that will actually affect your application and put you in the best position to be competitive. So we often, before we'll advise you on a specific project, you'll hear from us that we'll request you to send us this page so we can really provide concrete guidance to you. And as long as you send this to us at least a month before the deadline, then that should give us sufficient time to review it and, if needed, have a call to provide guidance. The SF424, the SBIR version, is the key application guide. It is over 100 pages, but you can really search through it, and it does walk through every single form and checkbox that you need to fill out. So it's really helpful in terms of explaining a lot of the details, what are the font sizes required. I mean, there's so many little technical things of a government application, and the SF424 is a great resource to guide you through all of that. We also now have the ability for companies to apply through NIH Assist, and that's a great kind of more web-based tutorial type that kind of walks you through each form of the application. So I definitely encourage you to look at the Assist platform for submission. The NIAID, National Institute for Allergies and Infectious Diseases, has several sample applications. So these are applications of companies that actually submitted and got a top score and were funded, and they've agreed to have those sample applications up on the website for educational purposes. So while it's NIAID and not NIA, it's still NIH, so it's the same format, the same review criteria, etc. So we definitely encourage you to look at those. We're actually at the NIA in the process trying to add some non-device, non-therapeutic projects, such as like digital health type. So we're hoping to add some more applications through that resource. In your application, you can specify which institute and study section you want it to go to. Study section is the NIH name for the review panel. You should justify, because the Center for Scientific Review does make the ultimate call. You can request multiple institutes and request dual assignment. So if you're working in a space that you think fits more than one institute, I do encourage you to request dual assignment, because that means if one institute, if you just miss their funding line, then maybe you would make the funding line of the second institute. And this is the PHS assignment request form that you would fill out as part of your application. So I mentioned the specific aims page as you know, perhaps the most important page of the application. There are several other parts of the application to pay attention to. The research strategy for phase 1 is limited to 6 pages. For phase 2, limited to 12 pages. That's where you want to actually talk about what you're proposing to do and include all the preliminary data that lays, really explains why the project is likely to be successful. So you want that background information, that detailed technical plan, the project scope. You always want to include potential pitfalls and alternative angles of attack. If you don't, you'll probably get dinged for it in peer review, so make sure to include that. And I would say, by and large, the one area that most scores go down the most is the approach section. So that's where you really need to, you know, have a couple plus pages on the approach. And really focus on like every model that you're using, why are you choosing that model, what metrics are you choosing, how are you quantitating that, how are you validating that. That tends to be the area where the reviewers focus the most. There are several other components to the application. You can include letters of support. You actually have to include letters of support for anyone that is getting money from the proposed grant. So if you have a consultant that's part of the project, you need a letter from them saying that they're going to do what you're saying they're going to do for the price that you're saying they're going to do it at. But I think actually most powerful is letters of support from people that are not financially benefiting in any way from your application being funded. So whether that be clinicians, end users, potential investors that, you know, can say like, if these aims were met and if they were able to achieve these milestones, you know, we would strongly consider an investment. Or as a clinician, this is the exact type of device that I need for my practice, for my patients. Those types of letters can make a key difference. For phase 2 applications, you do submit a 12-page commercialization plan. Bio sketches are required for all senior and key personnel. The detailed budget pages, detailed descriptions of facilities and equipment, and then when applicable, both human subjects research sections and vertebrate animals. So I encourage you to connect with us, as I mentioned, and I look forward to questions.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for sending in your questions. We've got some good ones here, so we're just going to get started. If you have additional questions, please type them in, and we're going to try and get to as many as we can. So, Todd, we have some questions about eligibility. The first one is, what is the guideline with respect to working with outside collaborators, CDMO as well as academic laboratories or clinical consortiums? What is the limit of their % effort, even in case the ideas and technologies are all based on our own development and patented or provisional patent filed?
Sure. So I alluded to some of this. So one, I should say that for the SBIR funded work, all the SBIR funds have to stay within the U.S. So part of the answer in terms of kind of eligibility requirements of potential subcontractors is that you must do all the work with SBIR funds in the U.S. So you can't collaborate and use some of the SBIR funds to go to a collaborator in another country. You can still partner with those people, you just can't do it under the SBIR funds. Now there are rare exceptions to that, but the two reasons why people most want to do work in another country are cost or familiarity with certain researchers, and those are not eligible for a waiver. But if you can actually show that you cannot do the work in the U.S., then it may be eligible for a waiver. So for example, we've had projects where you're working on an infectious disease that there's not enough of a patient population here, or you're working on a very specific animal model that no lab in the U.S. has. In those cases, then an exception can potentially be provided. In terms of percentages, so for phase 1, a minimum of 2/3 of the funds have to go to the small businesses. So what does that mean? That means up to 1/3 can be subcontracted, and a subcontract is where there's intellectual input on both sides. So those are typically academic collaborations, and academic collaborators will, in almost all cases, require indirect rates, and that automatically makes it a subcontract. But if you are working with a CRO where you're sending them the whatever it is, the drug or whatever, and they're running the assay, they're sending you the data, you're doing all the analysis, it's a fee per basis, then that can be part of the 2/3. I don't have a specific number of like how much of the company's costs can go to them. You still should show that you're doing some of the work yourself, and that's really more of a kind of a case-by-case basis.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question. For a small company that does not have anyone on staff with experience doing research, who should be the PI? Do we hire someone new with PI experience, or does someone at the company without that experience take on the role but hire a co-PI with the experience?
Yeah, so that's where, sending us that specific aims page and talking to us is probably helpful, because it really depends on the specific situation and the specific expertise of each of the potential individuals. In general, in many of those cases, you would want to do a multi-PI application so that you have, different PIs covered. So if it's a really small company, you're still going to have a lot of work being done at the academic institution. Even for an SBIR, you might want a co-PI be that academic leader that is very involved. The other thing to note for new startups is that both the personnel and the facility do not have to be in place at time of application. However, they are reviewed. So what we often recommend in those cases is that you include in your application who you will be bringing on, and where you will be doing the work. And for example, if it's, let's say, at the local incubator, you would have a letter of support from that incubator showing what space and resources you will have access to. But we don't actually require you to officially hire that person on or move into that space until we notify you that we are planning on funding you. So that's one thing to consider.
Thank you. We have some questions about the program itself. One is, what are the key differences between the commercialization readiness pilot program and phase 2B projects?
Yeah, so I'd say the two biggest differences are that the phase 2B follows the same subcontracting regulations as a phase 2, which means that no more than 50% of the budget can go to subcontracts. The CRP does not have those limitations, so if it makes sense to subcontract 80% of a CRP, that could be done, because it's really meant for, the types of activities where it may make sense to subcontract. And then it's also the nature of the activity. So the phase 2B, again, would follow similar to phase 2. So that would fund the types of activities that NIH research grants can fund, which is research and development activities. However, the CRP can fund commercialization readiness activities. So things like, IP filings and regulatory, documents and scale up manufacturing, things that might not be, exciting research, but are so critical to actually commercialize or get to clinic. That can be in the CRP, but that wouldn't review well in phase 2B. But you can also have both. Thank you.
Here's another question. Is there a salary cap for phase 1 SBIRs?
There is a general NIH salary cap. I don't remember it off the top of my head, but it's for all mechanisms. But there is a general NIH salary cap.
Okay, and then another similar question. What is the current pay line for R43s?
So at the NIA, we don't have a pay line for SBIRs. Typically, you know, it also depends. I mean, we have some money that's specific to Alzheimer's disease and related dementia, so sometimes we may be able to fund a different score range for those projects. So it really depends. I think typically, you know, projects funded in the 20s have a very good chance of being funded. Once you get into 30s, then it can start to vary. And then, you know, projects above 30s, so into the 40s, as an example, those often would require resubmission. We were able to fund more of those, you know, last year and the year before in the Alzheimer's space, but those applications have really started to pick up. So I really think at this point you want to get in the 20s or 30s to be competitive for funding.
Thank you. We have some questions about the research interests for the Institute. One question is, have you funded any clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease? And will you fund phase 2, or do you limit the funding to phase 1?
Great question. So we have funded it through SBIR. It does get a little tricky after the phase 1 stage because of those budget maximums. So for phase 2 being $2.5 million. So we will fund trials that can be, that are what we're funding for the trial can be under $2.5 million. The other thing that the NIA does pretty regularly is there are several small businesses that, you know, receive funding from us and got to the clinic, but then the NIA uses other research mechanisms such as an R01 to actually fund a larger clinical trial. So like we are funding a couple of phase 2 trials right now at small businesses, but because those budgets are higher than the small business allowances, we're funding it with other mechanisms.
Thank you very much. We have several questions about the review process. The first one is there a standard review panel for small businesses?
So the small business panels are separate from, you know, academic research grant panels. If you just Google NIH SBIR study sections, you can get the whole list of them. So it's not one, as you can imagine, we get thousands of applications. So there are several review panels grouped around technology and domain and, you know, disease specificity. But there are special emphasis panels. They tend to have similar membership from round to round, but each round is going to be a little different based on who's available and bringing in new people. And they tend to balance, you know, scientific and academic experts with, you know, business experts that also are in most cases scientists, but also have kind of that business expertise, whether they're at an SBIR awardee or they're, you know, someone that used to be in industry or things of that sort.
Thank you. Another question related to reviews is someone asked, did I interpret the timeline slides correctly that it takes 2 months post-council meeting to learn if your grant was selected for funding? Can you talk a little bit about the timing?
Sure. So as I said, I mean, most companies will know about 2.5 months after they submit their application, you know, how likely they are to be funded, unless they're, you know, right on that borderline. And then it goes through not just council, but a few weeks after council is our institute's internal funding meeting. And it's at that meeting that we actually get approval on a application by application basis. And then after that meeting, we can tell you if it's been scientifically selected for funding. So that meeting being, again, a few weeks after the council. Once that happens, then it goes to grants management, and then they begin the workup of the award. They're, you know, checking your just-in-time information, your eligibility, making sure, you know, you have all the animal welfare documents you need, or human subjects if appropriate. So that process can often take about 2 months. I mean, in all likelihood, if you're not eligible, you often know it, but it's not that many companies that get tripped up there, but we do need to do, of course, a full review of each company from the administrative and policy side. So that's what grants management does, and so we can tell you you're scientifically selected, but we can't tell you for sure that you're getting the money until grants management can confirm that all your paperwork is in order.
We have some questions about the application process. You mentioned text results in specific aims, but are figures allowed in the specific aims section, such as a prototype image?
I believe so. I'm trying to remember. I'm going to check the SF424 for sure, but honestly, most specific aims pages do not, and that's because you really want to use every inch of that page, and figures tend to take too much of that space. So people will most always save the figures for the research strategy, because you can still like label, link to a figure, say as shown in figure 1, but you don't have to actually include that figure on the specific aims page. The next page of your application is page 1 of the research strategy. So what I would recommend in that case is in your specific aims page, say as figure 1 shows our device ... and then figure 1 can be on page 1 of the research strategy, which is the next page.
On the same subject of numbers of pages, one person asked if the biosketches could be up to 5 pages or if that limit has changed.
I am not sure. That's another thing I would suggest consulting the SF424 on. There would be, if you go to the biosketch section, that would be very clearly labeled.
Review process. What is the success rate of SBIR and STTR applications at NIA for both phase 1 and phase 2?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the 2008. We're just in the process now that the year has ended of trying to run the 2019 numbers. I mean, typically it's similar to, I think, what happens at the NIH in terms of phase 1s being somewhere around 20%, phase 2s being, more in the 30 to 40% range. I think over the last few years, we have seen that percentage be significantly higher in the Alzheimer's disease and related dementia space, where, maybe we were able to fund 40% of the applications and take additional risk. It's hard to say, I think that's starting to come down a bit as more companies learn about the program, and we're starting to see more competitive applications. So we'll have to see kind of where that number goes.
Thank you. Another question about the application process. We have one question about having feasibility data for one area of research and planning a direct to phase 2 application. They also have other areas of research that they would like to conduct and are asking if they could submit other applications for phase 1 research. Would you encourage or discourage submitting multiple applications at once?
Sure. So let me take the first part of it, and then I get the second part of it. So for direct to phase 2, your feasibility data should specifically be feasibility for what you're going to do in the direct to phase 2. So whatever your proof of concept data is for that specific, indication and that specific project, that will be for direct to phase 2 on that. So if you have, feasibility data on Parkinson's as an example, and then you say you want to test that drug for Alzheimer's disease, I would say that you would have to go and do a phase 1 or a fast track because you don't have proof of concept data on Alzheimer's disease. To answer that second part of your question, no. Typically, my experience with these applications has been that when companies apply for multiple applications on one cycle, all of the applications tend to suffer. And I think it's a result of 2 factors. One being that it is, as I always tell people, there is really only one cost to applying for SBIR funds, and that's time. these applications are really hard to get right, and there's a lot of grantsmanship and a lot of effort that goes into it. And it's hard enough to have enough time to do that for one application, let alone trying to do that for more than one at any one time. So I find that those types of, grantsmanship and how well you write that application tends to go down when you try to, do more than one. And the other is, I think, on the review side. I think, because the review panels are somewhat broad, most often, most companies that are submitting to, the applications are related enough that they would end up in the same review panel. And then the reviewers tend to worry about, lack of focus, and the weaknesses tend to transfer over to the other more than the strengths do. So I always recommend to apply for one per cycle. Once you get that application and you get that award, then you can apply for another project. So you have, staggered funding and things like that. But I would recommend first focusing on getting your first award and applying for one at a time.
Thank you. We have several more questions on resources and programs for grantees. One is, can the Commercialization Readiness Pilot Program apply for funding towards clinical trials?
Yes, it can. That's one of the things that it's encouraged to support.
That was easy. Another question is, are there a list of types of allowable non-R&D activities that a CRP can fund?
So the CRP solicitation, which is out there, mentions what a CRP can fund. I believe, would it be the SF424 that we're talking about what types of activities they R44, a typical research grant, can fund or not fund. You probably get a pretty good idea just looking at the types of activities that CRP funds, but they're not mutually exclusive. There are some things that are fundable by both. I mean, typically a research grant, such as like a phase 2, funds research and development. One of the things that reviewers do look at is that key development activities, is there still a sense of innovation? Are you still advancing a project? Whereas with a CRP, it's more, these are things that you need to do. You might not learn much out of doing them, that's considered innovation and things of that sort. But if you don't do them, you won't get to the next step. So that's kind of how we look at it, but we can answer more, that's again where you send us a specific aims page, whether it be for phase 2 or CRP, and we can tell you if those activities could be in the other or vice versa. But key to note that for the CRP, you have to already have a phase 2 to apply.
Thank you. We have one more CRP question. One person wants to ask if you can apply for the CRP with a fast track, or do you have to wait until after that?
So you can apply for the CRP when you're in a phase 2. That can be a phase 2 of the fast track. So if you have a fast track but you're still in the phase 1 portion, then the answer is no. But if you have a fast track where you've already transitioned to phase 2 as part of your fast track, then the answer would be yes.
Thank you. In terms of resources and programs, we also have a question about the I-Corps program. Does it fund according to your research topic, and is the program available to all areas of research fields?
I believe it actually is available to all areas of research that the NIAID supports. So, well, I should say I don't believe every institute is signed on, but for the institutes that participate, I think all the areas of research under those institutes should be eligible. And I know for the NIA that is the case, that anything that we support would be eligible for I-Corps through our participation.
Todd, just a follow-up on that. Follow-up question on that. You have to be an SBIR, STTR awardee to be able to apply. Is that correct?
Right. So you have to be a phase 1 SBIR STTR awardee.
Thank you, Todd. We have some more questions about the application process. One person would like to know if they need a wet lab space before applying for the SBIR, or can they use the funds from SBIR to help rent that lab space?
Yeah, so assuming they're going to do wet lab work, I mean, you know, because not all projects, you know, are oriented in that way, but assuming they are, then that's, you know, the example that I mentioned earlier where you don't need to have it when you apply, but the reviewers are, as part of the environment criteria, reviewing and critiquing the facilities. So you do need to be able to show what that space will be. So what you can do is you can have a letter of support from an incubator that you, or, you know, other space that you plan on moving into, and show what those resources will be. And then when we select the project for funding, we will then require you to show us that you are moving into that facility prior to providing you the funds. And if let's say that facility is not available, then we would still give you the chance to move into a facility where you have similar level of resources to what was in your application and what the reviewers reviewed. So you can do that. You don't have to move in before you apply, but you have to show what those facilities will be.
Thank you, Todd. We have another question about flexibility in the awards. How flexible are the awards if a company may have independently made significant progress on the application for specific aims depending on investor support? Can a company shift funding to continue the project?
Yeah, great question. It comes up a lot in reality. So a couple things to note there. One is that pretty much across the NIH research mechanisms, there is a policy that any work that is done within 90 days of a notice of award can count as part of that award and be paid at the time of the award. What that means is anything, so when we actually issue the award and fund the project, we issue what's called the notice of award. If you take, let's say your project will get funded on August 1st. Anything that is done 90 days prior to August 1st, so I guess that would be about May 1st, right? May, June, July, yeah. So anything about May 1st or later that you've done, when you get the funds, you can then essentially draw down the money to cover that work that you did in the past 3 months, and that would still be considered as part of your project. So like if you've done AIM 1 in those 90 days prior to the notice of award, then, you know, AIM 1 is still part of your project and you would still pay yourself for AIM 1. So that's one thing to note. The other is that we do still allow flexibility because it is a grant. Typically, though, what we need to make sure is that, you know, you're not submitting an application for one thing that reviewers really like and program really likes, and then as soon as you get your money, you're doing something completely different. So the typical rule is that, you know, it cannot be significantly different, and I think what often is used as a proxy for significance is 25% of the budget. So if you have 4 aims and they all have about equal amounts of budget, and you're getting rid of one aim completely and switching it with a totally different aim, that would be allowed. But if you're changing half of the work, like completely changing half of the work, then it will probably be deemed too significant of a deviation from what was actually reviewed. And there is, you know, some flexibility. It is a bit of a case-by-case basis depending on the nature of the work, but that's a general principle.
Thank you, Todd. We're coming up pretty close to the end of our scheduled time. We can answer a few more questions, and then we can also take some offline via email, or we can continue.
Thank you to everyone for these. I mean, these are all spot-on questions. So I really appreciate all the great thought that's going into these questions.
Todd, we have a few questions about research interests. Beyond Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. One
Sure.
person wanted to know what other areas of aging or age-related disease more generally is NIA interested in. And another person asked about caregiver education programs, and would that be considered for a clinical trial?
Yeah, I mean, so caregiver education programs in general is something we are interested in funding. I think there is a real gap right now in terms of training for caregivers, and caregiving is such a huge expense globally, but including in this country. And training those caregivers and, you know, caregiver depression and things of that sort. I mean, these are real problems, and any innovations that can address them are well within our mission and our interest area. I think beyond that, I would say, you know, we do get a lot of questions on projects that could fit multiple institutes, and really, you know, so for example, heart disease is a clear example where many people will apply and say, oh, well, heart disease happens in older populations, so we want to come to NIA. In that case, it probably would be best to go to NHLBI, unless it's a really, like, the aging biology is part of the mechanism of the specific disease that you're looking at. I think, you know, areas where we tend up on more things that are more, you know, where NIA really is the main place you would go to for that. So, for example, we funded a lot in the fall detection and remote sensing, wearable sensors, you know, to enable aging in place, things in the kind of communications and digital health space around, you know, older adults and communication and livelihood, reminiscence. Things in geroscience are really interesting right now. So there's companies that are starting to figure out how to target, you know, the aging process that could lead to the formation of different diseases, and can you come up with drugs that specifically target the aging process. Things around incontinence would be within our mission. You know, lots of different areas. We go through it in much more detail in the omnibus solicitation, but that gives you, you know, some areas to think about. It's pretty broad.
Thank you, Todd. We have a question about allocation of funding and subcontracting. It's about skilled nursing facilities. If the nurses are implementing the intervention that's being studied and the skilled nursing facility agreed to participate for a fee of $5,000, would that $5,000 be considered part of the one-third subcontracting budget, or can it just be expensed?
I don't know. I mean, I think that's a very specific situation. We probably want to look at the aims and understand exactly what they're doing and what their contribution is. So I don't want to kind of answer without those details. It sounds like it could be either one, depending on the details, so we'd be happy to discuss.
Thank you, Todd. We have several questions about partnering. One person would like to know if you have a list of businesses that are looking for academic partners, and another would like to know if there's a list of small businesses that academic investigators can collaborate with. So it looks like they're looking for a matchmaking.
Yeah, we don't have like a specific matchmaking website. Those are kind of hard to keep and maintain. But what we do have that's actually I think the best government database that I've ever seen is the NIH Reporter Database. And that is a place where everything that we have funded at the NIH gets entered into that database, including our small business awards. And there's actually a field in that database that you can limit to just the small business awards, so that, you know, it's used in a lot of different ways. Small businesses I know do often use it to find academic collaborators, especially if they're looking for a local academic collaborator in their field. They can look at which academics we funded in that research space in their area or, you know, nationally. I think people also use it we recommend it for competitive intelligence, but in terms of your application. So if you're if you're doing something around fall detection, as I mentioned, we've funded a lot there, and a lot of things that have, things that are getting commercialized. So if you're going to have a new technology for fall detection, we really want to see how is this potentially better than the stuff we've already funded, and you can get an idea on what we've already funded by looking at that reporter database. So it can be used for, to identify. I mean, academics can see what small businesses in that geographic area are getting funded and around what. So you can use it in that way, but it's not specifically designed for that.
Hi, everyone. We are at 3:30, so we're going to chat out the contact information if you'd like to send us more questions, and we will direct them to Todd so that he can provide answers. We can ask just a couple of more questions. These are all related to specific funding opportunities. We'd just like to know, people would like to know when different ones are coming out, expected to be released. So I thought that was a good note to end on.
Yeah, so there is on the NIA website, any new concepts that are approved by council will be listed on the NIA websites and be linked to so the NIA, as I think I had in my previous slide, the NIA has a blog that they put out, essentially a newsletter, and I think it goes out every 2 weeks, I believe. And the new concepts will be highlighted in that. You'll get an overview of what that funding opportunity will look like. We can't release the whole funding opportunity until it's ready for full release, but it'll at least be a summary of what that concept is. So that's where you can see kind of what's coming down the pike. The next thing I'd say will be the NIH guide, which is where once a funding opportunity does get released, it will get released through the guide, and you can sign up to be on the guide listserv. We also have I believe we have a place on the NIA website where you can sign up for our listserv, and when we release a NIA SBIR solicitation, we will send an email to our listserv so you can sign up to be connected that way as well. And we can add, Melissa, will we be able to add all the attendees to our list so that when we release future funding opportunities, they'll get it?
Absolutely, we can do that. We have your registration emails, so we can do that. We've also chatted out contact information so that you can all get in touch with us if you have further questions or if your question wasn't answered. And with that, I think we need to bring this to a close. We really want to thank you for your participation and for your wonderful questions. I think that this got some really good different areas to cover and was very robust, and we appreciate your activity. So with that, thank you, everyone. Thank you to our partners, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you to our partners. It's a great partnership to be able to work with the companies in your areas. And also thank you to Melissa and the entire team for putting this all together.
Thank you, Todd.
Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.